The water rushed out like a broken dam. 20,000 gallons of crystal-clear defiance pouring into the storm drains as Margaret Whitmore screamed from her kitchen window. She'd demanded the pool for free, threatened lawsuits, rallied the entire HOA board against him, but Jake Morrison had one final card to play. As the last drop disappeared and the concrete tomb lay bare, Margaret's face twisted with something beyond rage, because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the pool held more than water. It held secrets. And now, with the neighborhood watching in stunned silence, those secrets were about to surface. Jake Morrison stood on his back deck, coffee mug in hand, watching the morning sun dance across the surface of his pool. The water was perfect, not a leaf out of place, pH balanced to the decimal, chlorine levels precisely calibrated. After 15 years of meticulous care, the pool had become more than a luxury. It was his sanctuary, his meditation, his escape from the corporate grind that had nearly killed him 3 years ago. The heart attack at 42 had been a wake-up call. The cardiologist's words still echoed. Stress will finish what genetics started, Mr. Morrison. Change your life, or it'll change for you. So Jake had changed everything, sold his consulting firm, moved to Meadowbrook Estates, bought the house with the perfect backyard, and spent his recovery learning the zen of pool maintenance. The doorbell's aggressive staccato shattered his morning peace. Jake sighed, recognizing the pattern. 3 short bursts, pause, 3 more. Margaret Whitmore's signaturing, as demanding and relentless as the woman herself. As HOA president, Margaret treated the neighborhood like her personal fiefdom, and Jake had become her latest target. He opened the door to find Margaret flanked by 2 other board members, Harold Chen, the nervous treasurer who always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and Deborah Sterling, whose surgically enhanced smile never reached her eyes. Good morning, Jake. Margaret's voice carried the false sweetness of artificial sweetener. She wore her usual uniform, crisp white blazer, pearls that probably cost more than most people's cars, and an expression that suggested she was doing him an enormous favor by gracing his doorstep. Margaret, Harold, Deborah. Jake nodded to each in turn. Little early for a house call, isn't it? The HOA board has reached a decision regarding your pool situation, Margaret announced. Not waiting for an invitation inside, she stepped past him into his foyer, the others following like well-trained soldiers. Jake's jaw tightened. What pool situation? Margaret's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Oh, don't play coy with us, Jake. The community has spoken. Your pool is a safety hazard and a liability nightmare. But we're prepared to offer you a very generous solution. She gestured toward his back windows, where his pool sparkled innocently in the morning light. The community needs a proper recreational facility. Your pool is perfectly positioned central to the neighborhood, easily accessible. We're prepared to take it off your hands. Take it off my hands. Jake's voice was dangerously quiet. Harold shifted uncomfortably. What Margaret means is, I know exactly what I mean, Harold. Margaret's tone could have frozen the pool solid. Jake, you're retired. You rarely use that pool anyway. Meanwhile, we have families with children who could benefit enormously from a community swimming facility. Jake looked at her for a long moment. And my compensation for this, generous gift. Compensation. Deborah's enhanced eyebrows shot toward her hairline. Jake, you'd be providing a service to the entire community. The gratitude alone should be payment enough. Plus, Margaret added with a smile that belonged in a shark documentary, we'd handle all the maintenance and liability. You'd never have to worry about pool chemicals or cleaning again, because it wouldn't be my pool anymore. Exactly. Margaret clapped her hands together as if he'd just solved a complex equation. I knew you'd see reason. Harold has the paperwork right here. No. The single word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Margaret's smile flickered for just a moment before reforming, more brittle than before. I'm sorry. No, Jake repeated, his voice gaining strength. I'm not giving you my pool. Harold cleared his throat nervously. Jake, maybe you should think about this. The HOA has significant influence over property values. And are you threatening me? Harold, of course not. Harold's face flushed red. I just meant that community cooperation is always appreciated when it comes to future assessments. And Harold, Jake's voice was ice cold. Are you threatening me? Nobody's threatening anyone, Margaret interjected smoothly. We're simply pointing out the benefits of community cooperation, neighbors helping neighbors. Surely you can understand that. Jake looked at the 3 of them, Margaret with her predatory smile, Harold fidgeting with his clipboard, Deborah examining her manicure with studied indifference. In his previous life, he would have negotiated, found some middle ground, made the problem go away with diplomacy and compromise. But that Jake had died in a hospital bed 3 years ago, flatlining, for 47 seconds before the paddles brought him back. This Jake had different priorities. Get out of my house. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Excuse me, I said get out, all of you, now. Jake, you're making a terrible mistake. Margaret said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. This community has ways of dealing with uncooperative neighbors. Ask the Johnsons about their fence violation fines. Ask the Patels about their landscaping citations. Ask the Williamses about their parking restrictions. Jake stepped closer, close enough to smell her expensive perfume mixed with the underlying scent of something rotten. Margaret, I'm going to say this once, very clearly, so there's no misunderstanding. My pool is not for sale, not for rent, not for community use, and not for you. It will never be yours. Do you understand me? For a moment, something ugly flickered behind Margaret's eyes, raw, naked entitlement mixed with disbelief that someone had dared to tell her no. Then the mask slipped back into place. You'll regret this decision, Jake, mark my words. She turned on her designer heel and stalked toward the door, Harold and Deborah scrambling to follow. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. This neighborhood is built on cooperation and mutual respect. People who don't understand that concept tend to find life here very, difficult. Jake smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Is that a threat, Margaret? It's a promise. The door slammed behind them with enough force to rattle the windows. Jake stood in his foyer for a long moment, listening to his heart pound. Not the irregular, struggling rhythm of 3 years ago, but strong and steady and furious. He walked to his back window and looked out at his pool, the morning sun turning the water into liquid diamonds. They wanted his sanctuary. They wanted to take the one thing that had kept him sane during the darkest period of his life and turn it into their personal playground. Margaret Whitmore, who lived in a mansion with her own pool, who drove a car worth more than most people's annual salary, who treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom, she wanted his pool for free. Jake pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. The call was answered on the second ring. Rodriguez Pool and Landscaping. This is Miguel. Miguel, it's Jake Morrison on Elm Street. I need to ask you about something unusual. Sure, Mr. Morrison, what's up? Jake looked out at his pool, already formulating a plan that would make Margaret Whitmore rue the day she darkened his doorstep. How long would it take to completely drain a pool? Drain it. Why would you want to? How long? Miguel. There was a pause. With the right equipment, maybe 6 hours for a pool your size. But Mr. Morrison, draining a pool can cause serious structural damage. The hydrostatic pressure keeps the concrete stable. Without water, you risk cracking, especially in this heat. What if that was the point? Another pause. Longer this time. Mr. Morrison, are you okay? Jake smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. I'm about to be. Over the next 3 days, Jake watched Margaret's campaign unfold with the precision of a military operation. First came the official HOA violation, noticeable safety barriers insufficient. Despite the fact that his fence met every code requirement, then the noise complaint about his pool pump, which had run quietly for 15 years without issue. Finally, the coup de grace, a formal petition signed by 37 neighbors, demanding he either share his pool or face legal action for creating an attractive nuisance. Jake read each document carefully, noting the legal language that Margaret must have paid a lawyer to craft. She was building a case, gathering ammunition, preparing for war. She thought she held all the cards, the HOA board, the neighborhood, support, the threat of endless legal fees and violations. She was wrong. On Friday evening, Jake received the call he'd been expecting. Margaret's voice was syrupy with false victory. Jake, I hope you've had time to reconsider our generous offer. Actually, Margaret, I have one if I knew you'd see reason. Harold can bring the paperwork over this evening. I've decided to drain my pool. Silence stretched across the phone line like a held breath. I'm sorry, what did you say? I'm draining my pool completely. Tomorrow morning, you can't do that. The mask slipped so fast, Jake could practically hear it hit the floor. That's destruction. At 6 a.m. sharp, Miguel Rodriguez pulled into Jake's driveway with a truck full of industrial pumps and enough hose to reach the storm drain 3 blocks away. The morning was already warm, promising another scorching day that would make Margaret's reaction even more explosive. You sure about this, Mr. Morrison? Miguel asked as he unloaded the equipment. Once we start, there's no going back. And in this heat, without water weight, your pool shell could crack like an eggshell. Jake handed him a coffee and a check. For triple the usual rate, I'm sure. Miguel studied his longtime customer's face and nodded slowly. Your pool, your call. But I got to ask, what did they do to piss you off this bad? They made the mistake of thinking I was weak. The industrial pumps roared to life at 7 a.m., their diesel engines echoing across the quiet suburban morning like mechanical thunder. Jake had positioned them strategically, maximum noise, maximum visibility. If Margaret wanted a spectacle, he'd give her one she'd never forget. By 7:15, windows were opening up and down Elm Street. Curious neighbors emerged from their houses in bathrobes and slippers, drawn by the unusual commotion. Jake stood on his deck like a general, surveying a battlefield. Coffee in hand, watching 20,000 gallons of crystal-clear water rush through industrial hoses toward the storm drains. Margaret appeared at 7:23. She came charging across the street in her silk pajamas and designer slippers, her perfectly coiffed hair wild from sleep, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. Behind her, Harold Chen jogged to keep up, clutching a tablet and looking like he was about to have a panic attack. "Stop!" Margaret screamed over the roar of the pumps. "Stop this right now." Jake looked down at her from his deck, his expression serene. "Good morning, Margaret. Lovely day for a pool draining, don't you think? This is insane. You're destroying valuable community property. Actually, I'm modifying my private property, on my land, which, last I checked, I still own." Margaret turned to Miguel, who was monitoring the pump pressure with professional detachment. "Turn those machines off right now. I'm ordering you as HOA president to cease this destruction immediately." Miguel looked at her, then at Jake, then back at her. "Lady, I don't work for no HOA. I work for Mr. Morrison. He pays me. I drain his pool, simple as that. I'll have your business license revoked. I'll sue you for property destruction." "Ill, Margaret." Jake's voice cut through her threats like a blade. "The only person being destructive here is you. I tried to be reasonable. I tried to be neighborly. But you decided to threaten me, to mobilize the entire HOA against me, to make my life hell because I wouldn't give you something that was never yours to begin with." More neighbors had gathered now, the Patels from next door, the retired Williamses, the young family from the corner house with their children pressed against the fence, watching in fascination as thousands of gallons of water disappeared down the storm drains. Harold held up his tablet with shaking hands. "Jake, please, this is a violation of HOA Covenant 47B regarding property modifications that affect community aesthetics." "The fine for this could be Harold," Jake interrupted, his voice dangerously calm. "What's the fine for harassment? What's the penalty for attempted extortion? What does the HOA charter say about board members abusing their authority for personal gain?" Harold's face went white. We weren't. It's not extortion. If what? If you pressure me enough, if you make my life miserable enough, if you find me into submission." Jake stepped down from his deck, moving closer to the gathered crowd. "Tell me, Harold, how many of our neighbors know that Margaret already has a pool, a bigger pool than mine, I might add, built into her backyard sanctuary that she never shares with anyone?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Patel leaned over to whisper something to her husband. The young mother from the corner house frowned, clearly processing this new information. Margaret's face flushed crimson. "That's completely irrelevant. My pool is private property," Jake finished. "Just like mine. But somehow, your private property stays private, while mine becomes community property the moment you decide you want it? That's not how this works." Margaret shrieked, her composure completely shattered. "You can't just destroy a perfectly good pool out of spite. Watch me." The pumps continued their relentless work. The water level had dropped 4 feet already, exposing the white tile ring that had been submerged for 15 years. Jake had spent countless hours cleaning those tiles, maintaining the perfect chemical balance, ensuring everything was pristine. Now he was watching it all disappear, and he felt nothing but grim satisfaction. Deborah Sterling arrived at 8:30, stepping carefully across the wet pavement in her yoga outfit and designer sneakers. She took one look at the scene: the industrial pumps, the rapidly draining pool, Margaret pacing like a caged animal, and her enhanced features contorted with disbelief. "This is madness," she declared. "Absolute madness. Jake, you're destroying tens of thousands of dollars in property value." "My property value," Jake corrected. "My choice. But what about the community? What about property values for the rest of us?" Jake looked at her for a long moment. "Deborah, when was the last time you invited a neighbor over for a swim? When was the last time any of you actually acted like a community instead of a collection of property investments?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, clearly struggling for an answer. "That's what I thought." Jake turned back to watch his pool drain. "You don't want community, Deborah. You want control. You want to be able to point to my pool during your real estate showings and say, 'Look at the amenities.' But you've never once offered to help maintain it, to share the costs, to actually treat it like community property. You just want to take it." By 9 a.m., a crowd of nearly 20 neighbors had gathered. Some watched in horror, others in fascination, a few with barely concealed admiration. The water level was down 6 feet now, revealing the deep-end steps that hadn't seen sunlight in over a decade. That's when Margaret played her final card. "I'm calling the police," she announced, pulling out her phone with theatrical flourish. "This is destruction of property, disturbing the peace, and probably half a dozen environmental violations." Jake smiled. "Go ahead." She dialed with sharp, angry jabs at her screen. "Yes, I need to report a property destruction in progress. Yes, I'll hold, ... While Margaret waited on hold, Jake noticed something that made his smile widen. At the far edge of the crowd, partially hidden behind the Williamses, stood Tom Bradley, the one neighbor who had consistently refused to sign Margaret's petition. Tom was a retired contractor, a man who understood property rights and the value of honest work. He was also, Jake happened to know, a man who had his own history with Margaret's overreach. Tom caught Jake's eye and nodded slowly, a gesture of understanding and approval that meant more than any crowd of supporters could have. The police arrived at 9:45 a.m., just as the water level hit the 7-foot mark. Officer Martinez stepped out of his patrol car, surveyed the scene with the weary expression of a man who had handled far too many HOA disputes, and approached Jake with professional courtesy. "Mr. Morrison, I am Officer Martinez. We received a complaint about property destruction." Jake extended his hand. "Officer Martinez, no destruction here, just a man draining his own pool on his own property." Officer Martinez looked at the industrial pumps, the massive hoses, the rapidly emptying pool, and the crowd of agitated neighbors. "Any particular reason for the dramatic timing?" "I'm renovating," Jake said simply. Margaret pushed forward, her silk pajamas now wrinkled and damp with perspiration. "Officer, this man is destroying community property out of pure spite. He's violating HOA covenants and ma'am," Officer Martinez held up a hand. "Is this Mr. Morrison's property?" "Well, yes, but the HOA has authority over." "Is he violating any city ordinances? Any actual laws?" Margaret sputtered. "The noise ordinance, those machines have been running since construction and landscaping are permitted starting at 7 a.m. Officer Martinez said patiently, "Is there anything else?" "Environmental violations. All that water going into the storm drains." Officer Martinez looked at Miguel, who had been quietly monitoring the operation. "You have the proper permits for water disposal." Miguel nodded, and produced a clipboard full of official forms. "All filed with the city yesterday. Water's clean, no chemicals, just standard pool draining procedures." Officer Martinez turned back to Margaret, whose face was now approaching the color of a ripe tomato. "Ma'am, unless you can show me an actual law being broken, this is a civil matter between neighbors. I'd suggest you work it out amongst yourselves. But have a good day, folks." Officer Martinez tipped his hat to Jake and walked back to his patrol car, leaving Margaret standing in the middle of the street like a woman who had just watched her entire world collapse. By 10:30 a.m., the pool was half empty. The shallow end was completely exposed, revealing the pristine concrete that had been hidden beneath 15 years of carefully maintained water. Jake stood at the edge, looking down into the growing cavern that had once been his sanctuary. Margaret had retreated to her house, but Jake could see her silhouette in her kitchen window, phone pressed to her ear. Probably calling lawyers. He thought, he had lawyers too, and more importantly, he had something Margaret had. The first crack appeared on Tuesday morning, a hairline fracture running diagonally across the deep end like a lightning bolt frozen in concrete. By Wednesday, it had widened to the thickness of a pencil. By Thursday, Jake could fit his finger into the gap, and the sound of settling concrete echoed through the empty shell like distant thunder. Margaret watched from her kitchen window with the obsessive intensity of a woman possessed. Jake had installed a security camera specifically to capture her daily vigil for hours every morning, 3 hours every evening, documenting his pool's spectacular self-destruction with the dedication of a scientist studying a natural disaster. What she didn't know was that Jake had been busy with more than just pool demolition. Friday afternoon brought Patricia Hernandez to Jake's front door, carrying a briefcase that contained 15 months of meticulous documentation. Jake had been building his case against Margaret since the day she'd first knocked on his door, but the pool incident had given him something invaluable: witnesses. 18 neighbors have agreed to provide statements, Patricia said, settling into Jake's living room with her files spread across the coffee table. Harold Chen has been particularly forthcoming about the board's targeting practices. Apparently, Margaret has a whole system: identify a property she wants to control, manufacture violations, apply pressure until the owner complies. Jake looked through the statements, recognizing names and signatures from people he'd barely spoken to before. The pool incident. The Patels had documented 3 years of frivolous landscaping citations. The Williamses had been hit with parking violations for having visitors. The young family from the corner had been cited for excessive noise because their children played in their own backyard. She's been running a protection racket, Jake said quietly. Nice property you have here. Shame if something happened to it. That's exactly what it is. And Jake, there's more. Patricia pulled out a thick folder marked confidential. I had a private investigator look into Margaret's finances. Do you know what her husband does for a living? Jake shook his head. He's a real estate developer. Specifically, he develops luxury community centers and recreation facilities, that kind that would require, say, an existing pool to serve as the centerpiece. The pieces clicked into place, like a combination lock opening. She wasn't trying to take my pool for the community. She was trying to take it for her husband's business. Community rec center, private membership fees, exclusive access for premium residents. She would have made hundreds of thousands of dollars off your pool, while claiming it was for the greater good. Jake sat back in his chair, feeling a cold fury settle in his chest. All those months of harassment, all those threats and violations and midnight phone calls, it had never been about community spirit or children's safety or any of the noble causes Margaret had claimed. It had been about money, about stealing his property to enrich herself and her husband. What's our next move? Patricia smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. We destroy her. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Monday morning, Patricia would file a federal lawsuit against Margaret, her husband, and the HOA board for conspiracy, extortion, and civil rights violations. But that was just the opening salvo. The real weapon was the evidence. Jake had been recording everything since the pool incident, every phone call, every confrontation, every threat. Pennsylvania was a one-party consent state, which meant he could legally record any conversation he was part of. And Margaret, in her arrogance and rage, had given him hours of incriminating audio. But the masterstroke came from an unexpected source. Harold Chen. Harold knocked on Jake's door Saturday evening, looking like a man who had spent the week wrestling with his conscience and finally found the courage to do the right thing. I have something for you, he said, pulling out a tablet. Margaret doesn't know I've been recording the board meetings. She thinks I'm just taking notes, but I've been documenting everything for months. He pulled up a video file dated 3 months before the pool incident. Margaret's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. The Morrison property is perfect for Phase 1 of Richard's Recreation Center development. The pool is already there, perfectly positioned. We just need to find a way to acquire it at minimal cost. Another board member's voice. What if he won't sell? Margaret's laugh was cold as winter. Then we make his life hell until he does. Violation notices, fines, harassment. We have the authority to make ownership so expensive and unpleasant that he'll beg us to take it off his hands. Harold's voice, barely audible. Isn't that illegal? Harold, it's called strategic enforcement. We're not breaking any laws. We're just prioritizing certain properties for enhanced community oversight. Jake looked at Harold with new respect. You've been sitting on this for months. I've been scared for months, Harold corrected. Margaret can be vindictive when crossed. But what you did with the pool, standing up to her like that, it gave me courage. Sometimes doing the right thing means risking everything. Patricia reviewed the recording with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who had just been handed a signed confession. This is conspiracy to commit extortion, abuse of authority, and about 6 other felonies. Margaret Whitmore is finished. Sunday night, Jake stood in his backyard looking down at his ruined pool. The cracks had spread like a spiderweb across the concrete, and the deep end had settled nearly 6 inches, creating a jagged chasm that looked like a miniature earthquake had struck. It was ugly, destructive, and absolutely perfect. Tomorrow, Margaret would learn that her campaign of harassment had been documented, recorded, and packaged into a federal lawsuit that would destroy her reputation, her husband's business, and her stranglehold on the neighborhood. But tonight, Jake wanted to savor the anticipation. His phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. Saw the news story about your pool on Channel 7. Your famous man. Pool guy who fought the HOA and won. My business is blowing up. Everybody wants to hire the contractor who helped stick it to the Karen. Jake smiled and typed back. Happy to help. Send me the video link. The news story was everything he could have hoped for. The reporter had interviewed several neighbors, gotten the full story of Margaret's harassment campaign, and painted Jake as a David fighting Goliath with a drain pump instead of a slingshot. The video of his empty, cracked pool had gone viral on social media, with thousands of comments supporting his stand against HOA tyranny. But the real victory would come tomorrow. Monday morning arrived with the precision of a military operation. At 8 a.m. sharp, Patricia Hernandez filed the federal lawsuit. At 8:15, she called a press conference on the steps of the courthouse. At 8:30, process servers appeared at Margaret's door, her husband's office, in the homes of every HOA board member. Jake watched the chaos unfold from his kitchen window, coffee in hand, feeling a deep satisfaction settle in his bones. Across the street, Margaret's house looked like a crime scene, multiple cars in the driveway, people in suits rushing in and out, the unmistakable energy of panic and damage control. His doorbell rang at 10 a.m. Jake opened it to find Tom Bradley, the retired contractor who had been his only supporter during the pool draining. Heard about the lawsuit on the radio, Tom said, grinning. Thought you might want to know. I've been documenting Margaret's harassment for 2 years. She tried to force me to remove my workshop shed, claimed it was an eyesore. When I refused, she hit me with noise violations every time I used a power tool. He pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. Dates, times, photos, recordings. If you need more ammunition, you've got it. By noon, Jake had received similar visits from 8 other neighbors. The Patels brought 3 years of landscaping citations. The Williamses had documented parking harassment. The young family from the corner house had recorded Margaret screaming at their children for playing too loudly in their own yard. Margaret's reign of terror had finally generated enough victims to form an army. and they were all rallying behind the man who had drained his pool rather than surrender to her demands. The phone call came at 2:17 p.m. Jake recognized the number. Attorney, Richard Blackwood, the same man who had tried to intimidate him during the pool draining. Mr. Morrison, I'm calling on behalf of my client to discuss a potential settlement. Jake put the call on speaker and gestured for Patricia, who had been coordinating the media response from his kitchen table, to listen. I'm listening, Jake said. Mrs. Whitmore is prepared to offer a formal apology and her resignation from the HOA board in exchange for dropping the federal charges. Jake looked at Patricia, who was already shaking her head. Mr. Blackwood, your client conducted a months-long campaign of harassment and extortion. She tried to steal my client's property through intimidation and abuse of authority. She's facing federal charges, civil penalties, and complete public humiliation. And you think an apology is going to make this go away? What do you want? Blackwood's voice was strained, the confident lawyer replaced by a desperate man trying to save his client from complete destruction. Patricia smiled. Full resignation from the HOA board. Public apology to every neighbor your client has harassed. Complete reimbursement for legal fees and damages. And a guarantee that neither Margaret nor her husband will